Good morning. Welcome, and thanks to all of you who are here with us in Washington and watching from around the world. I'm Chris Chivvis, the director of the Carnegie Endowment's Statecraft program, which Carnegie created last year to support the development of a more disciplined U.S. foreign policy that's clear-eyed about a more competitive world, realistic about the limits of U.S. power, and aligned with American domestic renewal. So we're delighted to have you here today to spend a few hours with us thinking about what the Biden administration has accomplished in its first 2 years in office, where it has faced obstacles, and what the future looks like for the president's major foreign policy objectives as we look ahead. We're really excited about this program. If you have questions, because this will be interactive, you should see a QR code on the screens on the right and the left that will take you to a form where you can post your question on the Carnegie website. We have a fantastic panel for the second half of the morning that includes a diverse cross-section of views on the Biden administration, both people from within Carnegie and some outside guests. My colleague, Matt Duss, is going to lead that discussion for us. But first, we have something that I'm even more excited about, which is a rare conversation with President Biden's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, led by Carnegie's president, Tino Cuellar. Tino joined Carnegie a little over a year ago. He's a former justice of the Supreme Court of California. He was the Stanley Morrison Professor of Law and Political Science at Stanford University, as well as the director of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies there. He served in the Obama White House, a number of other positions in government, and is a graduate of Harvard, Yale Law School, and Stanford. Tino, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Chris, and this is the kind of attendance we want at our staff meetings in the mornings. It is a great honor to have the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, back at Carnegie, and it's my honor to welcome you back, Jake. Jake Sullivan is somebody who needs no introduction, and in this conversation about the Biden administration's first 2 years and Biden administration's foreign policy, I don't need to belabor Jake's remarkable record of achievement, but I do want to highlight some of what makes him exceptionally qualified to be National Security Advisor. He's a former Deputy Chief of Staff at the State Department, former head of policy planning, former National Security Advisor to then Vice President Biden, and very importantly, somebody who spent some years at Carnegie developing ideas that are now quite interesting and relevant to the Biden administration. Jake, I want to take you back to 2019, when the Biden administration was no more than a glint in the eye of a future president. And President Biden had just published a piece in Foreign Affairs. He'd given a speech at CUNY about America's foreign policy, the vision he had, where he talked about the importance of investing and renewing America domestically, serving the interests of the middle class, broadly defined, reinvesting in American alliances, dealing with pandemics, transnational threats. We'll get into all of that. But let me start with a question about some of the ideas that you and Salman Ahmad worked on here at Carnegie around trying to define the interests of the American middle class and trying to have those interests well served and represented in foreign policy. So as you look back on the first 2 years of the Biden administration, what are some ways that you think that that agenda has been advanced, and where do you see it going in the next 2 years?
Well, first, thanks for giving me the opportunity to be back here with former colleagues and good friends, a place I got to, as you said, spend a considerable amount of time along with people like Salman and others developing a set of ideas and a set, from our perspective, of modes of thinking that we've tried to bring into the Biden administration. And I would say that there are three major areas where I feel very proud of the work that we've done to bring the interests of working people, the American middle class, more to the heart of U.S. foreign policy making. The first has been, as National Security Advisor, really lifting up the intersection between domestic and foreign policy and putting the full weight of the NSC behind the kinds of investments in our national strength that I think are going to be the basis for strong, inclusive economic growth, competitiveness, and American leadership in the key industries of the future that will sustain and grow the American middle class. And that's the work through the CHIPS and Science Act, through the Inflation Reduction Act, through the bipartisan infrastructure law, through executive orders on biotechnology and major investments in that field. And to really have a partnership between the National Economic Council and the National Security Council on the proposition that America is stronger when the American middle class is and American workers are really deeply invested in, and that it improves our competitive position in geopolitics, and it improves our capacity to respond to the great challenges of our time, whether it's climate or pandemics or the kinds of food and energy insecurity that we see around the world. So that's one. The second is, when we were thinking about these things, supply chains was not a headline issue in the world. That really came with COVID-19. But we have done an enormous amount of work at the NSC thinking about how we build strong, resilient, diversified supply chains to ensure that we don't see the kinds of disruptions in the future that we saw in 2020. And this is fundamental to the American middle class, being able to afford the things that they need for their lives and livelihoods, that we are not able to be coerced by adversaries at a moment of geopolitical peril by any country being able to turn off some essential good coming to the U.S. So this has fundamental impacts on the American middle class as well. And then the third area is to try to set the rules of the road internationally in ways that get away from just trying to make the world safe for corporate investment, and instead try to create broader-based inclusive economic growth everywhere, where we're growing middle classes not just in the United States but around the world. So we've launched the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity. We have put a lot of effort into a G7 initiative that President Biden has launched called the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, which is about a high standards effort to link our domestic infrastructure investments with infrastructure investments globally. And whether it's in technology or trade or investment rules or kind of the future of how we think about the clean energy transition, we've tried to establish an approach to these international economic issues that's much more in line with where American workers and the American middle class can draw benefits from our engagement globally, as opposed to simply experiencing the vulnerabilities and difficulties of that international engagement. So in those areas, I think we've made progress. Now, there's a lot of unfinished business. We've got to deliver on IPEF. We've got to really prove out the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. We have to make sure that we have fully kind of worked out the promise of these diversified and resilient supply chains along with allies and partners. We've got to make real the actual investments in these various laws that are just coming online now. So if the first 2 years was about constructing this approach, the next 2 years of the first term of the Biden administration will really be about implementation, and that's a major focus of ours at this point.
Great. We'll come back to this, but I want to take you back to your very earliest days as National Security Advisor, where you're thinking about how to structure the National Security Council to reflect these sorts of priorities. And meanwhile, you come in as the 28th National Security Advisor, and you're confronting this massive pandemic that has had all these economic, social, practical effects around the world and in the U.S. And as we think about the administration's approach to the pandemic, it's clear that you and your colleagues have focused a great deal on making sure Americans have access to vaccines. There has been talk sometimes about whether the U.S.'s effort to support countries around the world as they deal with the pandemic perhaps is everything it should be. And I wonder, as you look back on the pandemic response over the last 2 years, are there things that you think we might have done differently that we might learn from?
Well, certainly, in the early days and weeks and months of the pandemic, our capacity to respond decisively, effectively on everything from tooling up diagnostics and therapeutics to making sure that we had a vaccine delivery and distribution mechanism that really worked. That first year in particular, I think we lost a lot of time. And so when the Biden administration came into office, we were behind the curve on a lot of critical elements of this, and we tried to catch up as rapidly as we possibly could. Our first order of business, our first priority out of the gate was to make sure that we were vaccinating the American public, and that is the responsibility of a democratically elected president to deliver for their own people. But very rapidly, we stood up a global effort to distribute vaccines around the world. And by the time that we arrived at the G7 in June of 2021, just a few months into the Biden presidency, President Biden was able to stand up with the CEO of Pfizer and declare that we were in the midst of delivering 500 million vaccines that the United States had purchased and was giving for free, no strings attached, no political favors, no playing favorites. And if you look at the record over the course of 2021 and into 2022, not just in terms of making those vaccines available, but then standing up an effort to get shots into arms in hard-to-reach places, building on the backbone of what the U.S. has built over more than a decade through PEPFAR and the President's initiative on malaria, I actually think our record has borne out pretty well. We also were able to surge in response to immediate crises in other countries, like when India was hit with an incredibly challenging wave. I think people said in the first 24 hours we weren't moving as rapidly as we should have, but the net result of what the United States was able to mobilize to deliver to our friends in India, I think, was quite remarkable, and only the U.S. really has the reach and resolve to do that. So my view is that the biggest thing that we can do going forward as a lesson learned from the past 3 years is that we need to be set up to deal with the next pandemic in a much more resilient and responsive way. And that includes two major investments. First, on surveillance, we need to know ahead of time what's coming, and we got to do a better job integrating a global public health surveillance system. And then the second, with respect to being able to respond more rapidly, it can't just be that vaccine manufacturing takes place in the United States and Europe and India. We need that vaccine manufacturing to be distributed throughout the world, including in Africa, and the President spoke with the African leaders who gathered in Washington over the last 2 days on this topic. Same with therapeutics, so that we have a distributed system of production for all of the necessary implements to fight a pandemic, and that they're available to people right out of the gate. So it's not about the U.S. having to produce and distribute globally, but rather the U.S. helping build capacity in the Americas and Southeast Asia and Africa and elsewhere, and we are now well on our way to doing that.
And presumably that's a win-win. It both strengthens supply chains, but also gives these other countries an opportunity to partake in a major area of economic growth.
Exactly.
So that leads perfectly into another question, which is really about the backdrop of so much of what you and your colleagues deal with in national security, foreign policy, advancing American interests. There is a great deal of tumult and change in global political economy, you could say. Some of it is driven by concerns about climate, some is driven by changes in the developing world, changes in geopolitics, changes in technology, changes in domestic politics. So if we draw together these threads, dealing with the needs of the middle class and working Americans, the pandemic, changes in geopolitics, how do you see those fissures in political economy? Where do you think the world might and should go with respect to the institutions that underpin the rules-based international order? And in particular, where do you see tensions between maybe the understandable need for the U.S. to focus on the needs of its own population and a rising group of people all over the world who want to join the global middle class?
Well, I actually think we have to think about this in terms of growing the overall pie as opposed to how we divide it up. And when I look at the Inflation Reduction Act and the questions that have been raised about the extent to which it's causing some harms in other countries, my answer to that is that investment in clean energy is going to, in my view, create a virtuous cycle of investment in other parts of the world and also create massive spillover effects for both the development and deployment of new technologies that's going to benefit people everywhere, not just here in the United States. We are going to grow a clean energy industry that will, yes, unapologetically create millions of good-paying American jobs, and we regard that as a central effect of the IRA, but also create the capacity for new companies, new industries, and the deployment of clean energy infrastructure, clean energy power globally. And if you just look over the last couple of days in Europe at what the European Council has done, they have talked now about how they develop their own strategy that they can then align with ours. And then you look at how we are operating with key countries in the developing world. We've announced these just energy transition partnerships with both South Africa and Indonesia. These are not small deals. In Indonesia, we're talking close to $20 billion. In South Africa, close to $10 billion to help them transition from coal-fired power plants to renewable energy, and to do so with significant mobilization of investment. Link up the domestic investments of the United States in all these clean energy technologies with those kinds of projects and programs, and what you have is benefit actually extending to every corner of the world. And that's what's so exciting about these profound investments in the kind of key industries of the future, is that they don't just have to be about the United States doing it at the expense of everybody else, but rather the United States being a font of growth and energy and dynamism for the rest of the world. And similarly on the CHIPS and Science Act, what we're really talking about there is ensuring that we have set off a chain reaction of diversification in the semiconductor supply chain, so we don't have the problems that afflicted everyone with the semiconductor shortages of a couple of years ago, and that no country can so dominate any aspect of that critical supply chain that we have a single point of failure down the road. So from our perspective, there is actually not the kind of tension that has been built up between our ability to deliver domestically in jobs and for the middle class and what we can deliver internationally, both in terms of economic growth and in terms of global problem solving on these big challenges of our time. So fundamentally, we believe in the modern industrial strategy that we have put forward. We think it's good domestic policy, and we think it's good foreign policy.
On a related front, though, perhaps there is a trade-off for attention, and it has to do with China and the ways in which the administration has highlighted the importance of being ready to compete with China, but to cooperate with China as well. And even at an abstract level, that's a concept that is hard to square in some respects. And I just wonder what your sense is of how we've managed to thread that needle and what you might expect in the years to come.
Well, if you look at the national security strategy of the United States, it recognizes that we are dealing in a moment where there are two fundamental strategic challenges facing the United States. On the one hand, heightened geopolitical competition, and China is our most significant geopolitical competitor. On the other hand, significant transnational challenges that fundamentally affect the lives and security of people here and everywhere. Climate, pandemics being at the top of that list, but the need for strong sources of inclusive global economic growth, nuclear proliferation, terrorism. These two things are in tension because geopolitical competition makes it more difficult to rally the kind of cooperation necessary to solve the transnational challenges. And these transnational challenges create more pressures on the system that in some ways exacerbate geopolitical competition. So there is no doubt that any strategy has to take account of that structural tension between the two imperatives that we have built into our national security strategy. The good news, though, is that the recipe for solving both sets of strategic challenges is the same. It is those profound investments in our sources of national strength, which will help us solve major issues like public health, climate change, and food security, and so forth, and will also put us in a position of strength to compete. It is also building deep and strong alliances and partnerships with like-minded countries through the G7, through our traditional treaty alliances with the European Union, with the Quad, with some of our newer partnerships that we've put together on particular issues from food security to energy security. So investments at home, alignment with allies and partners, and then trying to set the terms, the rules of the road in these key areas in technology and trade and international economics. Those three things put together actually put us in the best position to both compete effectively and mobilize cooperation effectively while managing the tension. On China specifically, I would just say that the president's meeting with Xi Jinping in Bali, I think, put a fine point on the fact that we are pursuing a strategy that fundamentally does recognize that we are competing vigorously, but does not want to see that competition spill over into conflict, and further recognizes that there are areas where we can and must work with China because it's fundamentally in our interest to do so. Climate is a great example of that, but there are other examples as well. And the president and President Xi had the opportunity to task the teams with working together in areas of collaboration that are in our mutual interests and are in the larger global common interest. It doesn't erase the difficulties, the tensions, the potential for crises that need to be managed very carefully through effective communications channels, but it does mean that there is a responsible way to steward the relationship between the U.S. and the PRC and to effectuate a strategy towards the PRC that is not a caricature, but rather accounts for all of these complex realities.
Great. We'll come back to this, but I point out that as you lay this out, there's definitely an echo of that article that Biden wrote in 2019 and the speech he gave in 2019. So it does highlight that there's a degree of continuity of ideas articulated, ideas carried out. In a similar vein, if one looks at the 2020 Democratic Party platform, there's a reference to the real risks of forever wars and the need to pull back from that approach. And as you reflect on the approach you and your colleagues have taken to dealing with that, Afghanistan and so on, what is your sense of where we are on that front and what lessons might we learn from the last 2 years?
Well, President Biden has been clear and consistent from before he came into office and when he arrived in office that he intended to end the war in Afghanistan, to end the longest war in American history, to bring our troops home, and to focus our counterterrorism efforts globally to meet the challenges of 2021 and 2022 rather than 2001 and 2002. And that's a metastasized terrorism threat that has spread across parts of Africa, throughout the Middle East, and elsewhere, and is not simply located in the mountains of Afghanistan. When you end a 20-year war, with all of the decisions and all of the choices that have piled up, there are going to be significant challenges, and there were significant challenges in the end of that war, and the human costs and the human suffering that we all saw on television is something that we will carry. But fundamentally, strategically, it was the right decision for the United States to end the conflict in Afghanistan, to bring our troops home, and to shift to a different approach when it comes to counterterrorism. And in fact, the action that we took against the emir of al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, shows that we maintain the capability to hold at risk al-Qaeda even without thousands of troops on the ground. The other thing that I would say, sitting here today, supporting Ukraine in its effort to defend itself against Russian aggression, dealing with this other significant set of challenges that we are confronting around the world. It is a good thing from a strategic point of view that the United States is not currently in the middle of a war in Afghanistan with thousands of U.S. troops exposed and at risk. It is good that those troops are out of harm's way, and it is good that we are in a position to be able to focus on both supporting our partner in a major war in Europe and dealing with this larger set of challenges that we've just been speaking about. But it doesn't mean that these threats haven't gone away, and it doesn't mean that we can simply turn our back on Afghanistan. And we have continued to provide significant amounts of humanitarian assistance. We have engaged with the Taliban to try to advance both our interests and our values. We have worked with the international community. And critically, we have continued to bring out Afghan allies who supported the United States. And we made a pledge that there would be no time limit on doing that, and there has not been. We continue to do that week in, week out, month in, month out, and that will continue as long as Joe Biden is president.
None of us who work on global issues of security and peace have been able to put the Ukraine conflict probably out of our minds for more than a few minutes at a time. And when you think about what that represents for the U.S., for the rules-based international order, for the Biden administration, reflect a bit on how you and your colleagues had to pivot to deal with that, how much of that you saw coming, and in particular, perhaps one of the hardest questions now is, this is not a conflict that seems to be showing any signs of being over anytime soon. tens of thousands of shells are being fired every day. Some observers highlight that there's a similarity to World War I in some respects. So as we think about what role the U.S. can, should, must play for the long run there, and how you see the arc of that conflict over months or years, what comes to mind?
So in terms of whether we saw it coming, when I entered my job as National Security Advisor in January of 2021, the notion that there would be the scope, scale, and ultimate objective of an invasion, seizing the capital of a neighboring country, essentially trying to wipe that country off the map, that was not something I entered expecting. Russia obviously had already invaded Ukraine, and further invasions were certainly something we had to consider to be a very real risk. And in the early months of our time, we saw a big Russian buildup on the border. But the scale and ambition of the Russian war against Ukraine that was unleashed in February was something that really only came into focus for us towards the end of last year. And of course, then we did see it coming, and in fact told the whole world what we saw coming, having made the strategic decision to declassify intelligence and share it both with allies and with the public to say, this is what the Russians are up to. We're not going to let them get the element of surprise. We're not going to let them build some pretext or false flag for what they're doing. They're going to have to own it, and we are going to prepare everybody for it. It has been a remarkable thing to watch Ukraine step up with the support of the United States and our Western allies to defend their country, to win the Battle of Kyiv, to win the Battle of Kharkiv, to win the Battle of Kherson, and to push the Russians out of significant tracts of Ukrainian territory, and for that country to still stand proud, to have repelled the Russian invaders from most of the country, and now to be fighting to reclaim the remaining land. We don't know where this is going to end up. What we do know is that it's our job to continue to sustain our military support to Ukraine so they are in the best possible position on the battlefield, so that if and when diplomacy is ripe, they will be in the best possible position at the negotiating table. That moment is not ripe now, and so as a result, we have gone to Congress and asked for a substantial amount of further resources to be able to continue to ensure Ukraine has the means to fight this war. We're confident we will get strong bipartisan support for that. And any hope Putin has that we are going to flag in our support or get divided or reduce our support, I think with each passing month, that hope is proving to be totally misplaced. So I'm not going to predict the future. I'm only going to assure that in the present, we are doing everything we can to maximize Ukraine's chances of being able to defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity, and at the same time to try to manage the spillovers of this war globally, which was, of course, a significant topic of conversation at the African Leaders Summit on the question of food security and energy security. And that's something that we have been very attentive to as we build a coherent strategy. But at the end of 2022, if you had said to me we'd be in the position we were in, given what we saw coming at the beginning of 2022, I would have thought that was a wildly optimistic expectation, which is not to minimize the grievous human suffering that is occurring even today with these brutal attacks on civilian infrastructure. But it is to say that Ukraine has responded and the world has responded to push the Russians back from their objectives and to deal them a severe blow because of their flagrant violation of the UN Charter and international law.
But just to highlight perhaps one theme that I'm hearing, you can tell me if I'm hearing it right and then maybe ask a quick follow-up question. It sounds like in all of this, there is a commitment on the part of the U.S. that you see as both normative as well as descriptively possible to be in it for the long haul if that's what's required. That's what I'm hearing. And then on a related front, that also highlights the extent to which the U.S. has to work with countries that are sometimes partners, sometimes in Africa, sometimes elsewhere, who might be among the 30-plus countries that voted against the U.S.-backed resolution of the UN General Assembly condemning Russia's behavior. So threading that needle of, on the one hand, staying steadfast in support of the Ukrainians, and at the same time working with countries that don't see this quite the way the U.S. sees it seems like a challenge.
Look, at the end of the day, the approach of the Biden administration is really to try to fix our eyes pretty far out into the future and to say, where do we want the United States and our like-minded allies and partners to be a decade from now or 2 decades from now? How do we put ourselves in a maximally strategically sound position to both deal with our competitors and to solve the great problems of our time? Withdrawing from Afghanistan was fundamentally about improving America's strategic position, not continuing to be in a fight, in a war that had gone on for 20 years and from a strategic perspective no longer made sense. Investing massive sums in the sources of America's domestic strength is about enhancing our strategic position over the long haul. Being in it in Ukraine to ensure that we are standing up for the principles of an international order that sustains sovereignty and territorial integrity and rejects aggression, that has required resources, it has required resolve, and yes, it is likely to go on for quite some time. But then at the same time, trying to build structures that deal with those challenges that partners around the world who may not vote with us on every resolution in the UN on Ukraine or other things, on an energy transition that requires both the provision of reliable energy today for the livelihoods of working people everywhere, but also helps us solve the climate crisis in short order, on food security, on technology that is more a force for good than a force for ill. If you look at the metrics by which to judge your administration, our view is that we're trying to set out 5 and 10 and 20-year metrics rather than 1 and 2 and 3-year metrics. And judged against that, we feel very good about the set of investments we've made, both at home and globally. And 2022 has been an interesting year because just this year, the president has hosted all of the leaders of the Americas, all of the leaders of Africa, all of the leaders of Southeast Asia, all of the leaders of the Pacific Islands. He's attended very consequential G7 and G20 summits. He's gone to a historic NATO summit that is, welcome 2 new allies to the path of NATO membership. This period of basically sitting down with the whole world at what he calls an inflection point to show that the United States is going to play the long game against both geopolitical competition and the transnational challenges of our time. We sit here at the end of this year, looking back at the beginning of this year, and just feel like we have made these kinds of down payments that are beginning to pay off for us, and we'll see where things go.
We're about to turn to questions from the audience, but I want to ask you another question about the long game in a sense. I will never forget January 6th. I'm sure that's probably true for everybody in this room. And as we approach the 2-year anniversary of January 6th and think about the state of democracy in the US, around the world, the Democracy Summit that the Biden administration hosted, what's your sense of where we are with respect to preserving, invigorating democracy, and where do you see us needing to go?
I'll say that one of the striking things for me was being at the East Asia Summit in Cambodia just days after the midterm elections. And President Biden walking in to a session with all of the leaders of Southeast Asia and many other leaders from around the Indo-Pacific, and having the first question everyone asked him be about, hey, what's going on in Nevada? Which including non-democratically elected leaders from that region who are closely following our elections, kind of wondering state by state. And it was a reminder that the rest of the world is looking at the state of American democracy and the outcome of American elections and saying, what does this tell us about America's staying power on the international stage? What does this tell us about the health and vitality of American institutions? And so it is definitely the case that January 6th raised a lot of questions in a lot of corners, and that we have been, in a way, over the last 2 years, trying to show and not just tell that the United States is a reliable partner, is a reliable democracy, And of course, President Biden has spoken to this issue of democracy passionately from the heart in several significant addresses over his first 2 years in office. But sitting where I do in the National Security Council, I look at this from the point of view of our capacity to effectively shape world events in light of the fact that these questions have been raised because of what happened on January 6th. I think where we sit 2 years in is better than where we were the day we entered office, just 2 weeks after January 6th had unfolded. And I think it is not lost on people around the world that the assertions of election denialism, and so those forces of election denialism did not fare so well. And that's something that is a theme that is now reflected in global commentary. But it's a constant work in progress. Now, the one other thing I will say about January 6th is that I think it also allows an opportunity for the president to have honest conversations with countries suffering from their own democratic deficits or their own democratic difficulties without sounding like we're imposing, dictating, lecturing, where he can say, look, we're walking our own road. We have our own challenges. So we come at this from humility. Now we want to talk about your road and your challenges. How can we work together to strengthen democracy in both of our countries? And I saw him do that just a couple of days ago when he gathered a group of African leaders who have elections coming up in 2023. We had talked about the challenges in American elections and the challenges in these elections. These are not perfect analogies by any stretch, but some of the themes are similar. And so actually, in a way, it's allowed for a kind of collaborative conversation on the health and state of democracy globally that we believe can help propel a reversal of some of the trends we've seen recently about democratic backsliding.
Thank you. You mentioned the Africa Summit. Right here in this room, we hosted one of the heads of state that you all invited and had a vigorous and interesting discussion about investment, about the future of Africa. So picking up on maybe a theme that's cut across a lot of your answers, which is about reconciling the needs of the American people with a complicated and unruly world, say a bit about how that Africa Summit maybe reflects an agenda that highlights that interconnection, how we might advance the legitimate needs, interests, and concerns of a very diverse and complicated continent that has faced many challenges in the past and unusual growth opportunities now with the needs of the American people.
I mean, look, if you look out to 2050 at where sources of global growth, dynamism, opportunity are for the United States, for our economy, for our capacity to partner with vibrant countries helping solve global problems, a huge amount of that lies in Africa. On the other hand, when you look at the questions of insecurity and corruption and terrorism, the challenges that the continent, many parts of the continent are grappling with today, the spread of disease as well that could turn into a global pandemic. There are also threats that we need to work together to manage that can help make the American people more safe and secure. So if you look at Agenda 2063, which is the African Union's vision document for the continent for basically 100 years since the founding of the original Organization of African Unity. And then you look at what is it that the American people, your average family in my hometown of Minneapolis, is looking for in terms of economic security, health security, personal security, dealing with the climate, dealing with inflation. These are issues that are very common and for which I think we increasingly need to look to a set of countries that are fundamentally pro-American in their populations in Africa, with whom we could have great partnerships to help improve the lives and livelihoods of people on both sides of the Atlantic. And my view actually is that there isn't as much tension in this. There's a lot more mutually reinforcing capacity that needs to be unlocked. And the last couple of days has been pretty exciting in that regard. And actually to see the diaspora community, and the president signed an executive order on how we most effectively leverage the African diaspora here, shows the linkages and interconnections between the African continent and the United States are already there and can only, can be multiplied and enhanced over the years to come.
going north from Africa to Europe, we have a question about the transatlantic relationship, which was not necessarily an easy one in the previous administration. So looking over the last 2 years, what do you think has changed in the transatlantic relationship, and how do you see that progressing in the next 2 years?
Well, the previous administration had a notoriously difficult and challenging time with respect to the transatlantic relationship. The previous president had a particular view about NATO and the European Union and some specific European countries. This president is a fundamental transatlanticist. He believes deeply in NATO, believes deeply in a strong U.S.-European Union partnership, and believes that that is a platform upon which to build global collaboration on every significant issue. And if you look at the depth of convergence on the major questions of our time, whether it's on issues of trade and technology, which I'll come back to, or the war in Ukraine, or how we effectively deal with the whole agenda under the G7 and the G20 and how we've come together around that, I think we're in a very, very strong position. Doesn't mean that there haven't been disagreements kind of among family the way that there always are, and those have been apparent over the last 2 years as well. The most recent one is with respect to the Inflation Reduction Act, but actually President Macron's visit here, President Biden's work with President von der Leyen at the European Commission, and then what we saw emerge from the European Council this week shows actually that the IRA represents much more of an opportunity than an irritant, actually, that we can build a coherent clean energy ecosystem between the US and Europe, bringing in countries from around the world that is going to help unlock and unleash innovation, industry, and solutions for climate. So I actually think 2023 is a very exciting year because these past 2 months have been about working out, the challenges in the IRA between the US and Europe. I think the next year is going to be about the opportunities it's going to afford us to chart a vision on one of the most significant issues we face. And we've built up the goodwill, the trust, and even most importantly, the operating systems through the various mechanisms we've established between the US and Europe to be able to effectively do that. So I actually think there have been very few moments where transatlantic relations have been as robust and have created as many opportunities as what we find ourselves with between the US and Europe right at this moment.
There's a question from the audience that highlights the challenges in trying to understand and frame America's role in the world. You've written about this. At one point, if I remember correctly, you reflected a bit on the challenge of thinking about the U.S. as an indispensable nation and maybe sometimes the downsides of that particular metaphor or framing. So how would you describe America's role in the world, and how do you see that evolving in the next 2 years?
Well, I think that fundamentally, America's role in the world is one in which our job is to try to take what are a unique set of capacities and a unique set of attributes. We are a distinctive actor in the world stage, and I wrote about this in the piece in The Atlantic a few years ago, and put those to work to mobilize and catalyze collective action to solve the great challenges of our time, which will make the lives of the American people better and make the lives of people everywhere better. And that does not mean that we are completely calling the shots, telling everybody what to do, policing the world. It rather means that we are building coalitions, sometimes even with our competitors in those coalitions, if it comes to something like the climate crisis or public health, to effectively address the issues that matter the most. And that goes for climate and the energy transition. It goes for trying to solve the problem of agriculture and food security. It goes for trying to, in a very difficult moment, continue to sustain the nuclear non-proliferation regime. It goes in every domain, including cyberspace. So that is how I would describe what the United States' role should be going forward. And in doing that, we have to pay very close attention, not just to some disaggregated notion of the national interest, but the very specific interest of people, and especially working people, and what we have to do to make their lives better, safer, and easier. And that should be the metric by which we judge everything we are doing in international affairs. And I believe that one of the unique attributes of the United States is we are a global power that has a positive sum view. And we believe that others can do better, not at our expense, but their doing better helps us as well. And that was core to the notion of rebuilding Japan and Germany, two vanquished foes after the end of the Second World War. And now they've been built into thriving economies who compete with us, actually, economically, but also mutually reinforce our collective capacity to solve these big problems. So that's how I look at what we're trying to accomplish. And the real question is, what do we got to put in place to be able to do that over the midterm in a very turbulent, fast-changing world? That's the question we ask every day, and we're one by one trying to put those pieces in place so that when you step back and you look at where we are on the assets and liabilities of the United States, have we reduced our liabilities? And have we increased our assets in terms of our investment at home, our alliances, the initiatives we've set up to solve problems? Have we gotten out of wars that don't make sense? Have we reduced the extent to which there are frictions that are holding back our ability to cooperate effectively? Have we postured ourselves effectively against threats? That's how we think about this question every day. And we're trying to ultimately leave behind an asset and liability sheet that looks better than what we inherited.
That leads perfectly into the very last question I'll ask you, which I think you can probably answer in a minute. 2 busy years lie ahead in this presidential term, and everything we've talked about is going to have to be on the agenda somewhere. But what are 2 issues that you particularly very much hope to get some traction on as you think about the full range of challenges before you?
So one is, let me answer your question this way. First, I said in one of my earlier answers that the first 2 years were about kind of passing everything, starting everything, and now the next 2 years are about implementation. So one of the biggest things I'm focused on is not the next thing, it's everything we've done in the first 2 years, we have to deliver on the promise of that. And we have to just be relentless about implementation so that we are delivering on the things we said we would do. We're delivering on the domestic investments, and we're delivering on the various international initiatives we've set up. So if I wasn't adding an issue, I was merely executing against the agenda we've already done, and we did that really effectively, I would say that's pretty darn good. But of course, that's incomplete because there are more questions that we're going to have to grapple with that come to the fore. One of the issues that has been exposed through the war in Ukraine is the defense industrial base. And the need to ensure that we have the same kind of diversified, resilient supply chain and production capacity for our defense industrial base that we have now tried to build with respect to on the public health side coming out of COVID. Not just us, but our entire allied ecosystem. How do we make sure we're in a position midterm where we can produce the necessary elements to be able to support Ukraine, to be able to deal with contingencies elsewhere in the world? And this is something that, we have inherited that over the course of decades of underinvestment, concentration, consolidation, and a lot of other choices, we are not in the position we need to be in. So that is a big area that I would like to deliver against. And then the second area that is now, the last 2 years have really exposed where we have more work to do, is we've tended to think about the climate issue here and then sort of the issue of kind of energy affordability and reliability here. These two things have become deeply connected in the last 2 years. How do we actually execute an energy transition that does not break the backs of working people but delivers on our climate goals? That is a really hard thing to do. It requires an enormous amount of coordination, intelligent policy making, effective diplomacy. And so that is another major area that over the course of the next 2 years, we have to work very hard to get right.
We'll do our best at Carnegie to help. It's a major priority for us too. Jake, thank you for your candor, for your public service. Welcome back to Carnegie. I hope you appreciate we remodeled the building for you.
Yes, thank you.
And we look forward to welcoming you back. Thank
Awesome.
you.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
It was terrific, terrific. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
Great.